Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I'll be talking about video game monsters. Oh, what was that? Okay, I'll just do it. I'll be talking about video game monsters. This is a part of a larger project about games and transgressive aesthetics undertaken at the University of Bergen. And I've been motivated to study video game monsters despite the fact that there's just very little written about monsters, except for some, there were some papers about zombies, but not about monsters in general. And I started by writing a chapter for this book, Monster Culture in the 21st Century, and then I continued. And today I want to talk about the ways in which role-playing games and computer games transform monstrosity from something that is frightening and unknowable to something that is contained and knowable. Right now, most of the existing theory of monstrosity in humanities is based around the idea of monsters as unknowable, fearful, and awe-inspiring, or sublime. But video game monsters usually play the role of objects of player action. And the point is to get to know them and then to defeat them. And to understand this type of video game monstrosity, I will look for like a new conceptualization of it, inspired by history of cybernetics, by medieval bestiaries and Janet Mary. And I will, in this talk, I will simplify the paper that you can read. So if you want more nuance and more example, please read the paper. I will first talk about the idea of sublime monstrosity. Then I will talk about encyclopedic containment as the other approach, and then I will demonstrate this on demonstrate tension on the example of Dungeons & Dragons, a game that kind of introduced monsters into games. And then I will look at a contemporary example, which would be God of War. And while summing up. Sorry? Yeah. When summing up the existing theories of monsters, the philosopher Stephen Asma identifies an underlying sublime thesis, that he calls it, based on Kant's understanding of the sublime. And in Kant's words, the sublime appears to be ill-adapted to our faculty of presentation and does violence to the imagination. Daniel Vella, who has worked on the sublime in video games, has connected to feelings of awe and terror that we are supposed to experience when we're confronted with the sublime. Asma has also tied this to so-called radical vulnerability, the danger of being crushed and baffled by the monster whose power is much more than ours, or a monster that we cannot really understand. The sublime thesis has been quite influential in the humanities. The philosopher Richard Kearney says that monsters are tokens of fracture within the human psyche. They are unnatural, transgressive, obscene, contradictory, heterogeneous, mad. Julia Kristeva ties this to the concept of abject, which is used quite often in horror studies. And in her view, the abject is what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect Bohr's position rules, the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite. It is not an object facing me, which I name or imagine. So according to the sublime thesis then, monsters can be awe-inspiring and intractable, and our systems of representation a struggle to cope with them. And to give an example from literature, I used to give an example from Lovecraft, but I will give an example from the Mesopotamian epic of creation today. This is the description of the monster god Marduk. And I won't read it all, but I think I'll just read a few lines. His limbs were ingeniously made beyond comprehension, impossible to understand, too difficult to perceive. Highest among the gods, his form was outstanding, his limbs were very long, his height outstanding. And to contrast, I will talk about encyclopedic containment. My thinking about this approach to monstrosity derives from Janet Mary's discussion of the encyclopedic nature of video games and digital media. And she argues that the capacity to represent enormous quantities of information in digital form translates into an artist's potential to offer a wealth of detail, to represent the world with both scope and particularity, which we couldn't really see in the example of Marduk, right? And this encyclopedic impulse is not just an attribute of digital media, but although computer might be its kind of ultimate expression, but it is connected to like a more general urge to control and contain the unknown and the contingencies of the chaotic world. In essence, it's a colonizing move. In the history of medieval Europe, and also China, collecting monsters into books went hand in hand with mapping of unknown territories. So medieval bestiaries enumerated and described monsters from different corners of the world, and it was a process of containment, as medieval scholars would tell us, through which a culture defines its borders and distinguishes itself from monstrous others. I like this quote from Richard Strasberg, who's a scholar of Chinese bestiaries. The reader willingly consumed an illusion that all the important objects of reality had been collected and ordered according to fundamental taxonomy, and that these things were now manageable and available for exploitation, or in games it would be looting, or and then crafting and so on. And this logic of control became pervasive along with the spread of statistics, bureaucratic administration, and computation. It leads to a totalizing vision of the world in which everything can be turned into an object, reduced to discrete units of information, and filed into nomenclatures. So the early computational models of the world built on these ideas, and particularly Cold War era cybernetics. And we can read it in Norbert Wiener, but we can also read it in some historical interpretations of Norbert Wiener. There were these military models of reality designed to attain, to quote Patrick Rogan, total control over a world reduced to calculable mechanical operations. So in these models, whatever appeared on the computer monitor in the monitored territory was a potential enemy. And the historian of science, Peter Galison, has called this underlying principle of these models the ontology of the enemy. He notes that this enemy was ultimately knowable and calculable. To quote, on the mechanized battlefield, the enemy was neither invisible nor irrational. There was an enemy at home this was an enemy at home in the world of strategy, tactics, and maneuver. And besides this powerful vision of the other as calculable enemy, there was also a series of more subtle developments in popular culture, the long tradition of monsters used as amusements and attractions. Medieval bestiaries also were, one of their functions was also entertainment. The popularity of dinosaur parks already started in the 19th century, and then later games like Monster in My Pocket or Pokemon represent monsters and demons as something that you can collect. They're numbered series of things that you can buy and add to your collections. I will now talk about Dungeons & Dragons. I think that Dungeons & Dragons rulebooks are among the most influential texts in the history of computer and video games. Although they don't really rely on computer technology, but they are computational in some ways. I'll be talking about the 1974 and 1978 editions. And as the name suggests, monsters, and specifically dragons, but not only dragons, are a cornerstone of Dungeons & Dragons. The game originated in the miniature war game culture, which had traditionally emphasized the realism of combat. And in the 1960s, several gamers introduced fantasy elements, including magic and monsters. This was in part to kind of spice up the gameplay, but also because of the popularity of fantasy literature, and especially Tolkien, whose approach to world building was also very encyclopedic. So although Dungeons & Dragons doesn't require a computer, it is a computational game, and the monsters are driven by algorithms and statistics. Unlike medieval bestiaries, which were primarily descriptive and educational texts, D&D monster manuals are constitutive texts. So they declare the existence of monsters in a simulated world, and they ascribe statistics and action and possible actions to these monsters. The fact that monsters appeared in an extension of a miniature war game required them to be present in the game's simulated world, which means that they had to be on scale. They had to be somehow accounted for by the system. They had to conform to the rules of the game. So they could not just be outstanding, like Marduk. There is a certain paradox, or even folly, I think, in the way that D&D attempted to kind of meticulously simulate battles with fantastic monsters that don't exist, but they were simulated. So here you can see a table showing, like a wide range of monsters on some level of detail. Creatures from different mythologies and popular culture texts were made to fit one matrix of mathematical rules. And in the later editions, you could also find illustrations. And despite there is some randomness in Dungeons & Dragons for sure, but still the behavior of monsters is quite predictable. So it's a game of fantasy, but it's also a game of control, and it's not just about Dungeons and Dragons, but it's also about dice and spreadsheets and kind of min-maxing and learning how to play the game well. It combines the thrill of exploration of the unknown with the security of the fact that you can ultimately kind of get to know all these things. Yeah, let me just... At least in its initial stages, D&D firmly represented monsters as objects of player actions. In fact, the game assumes that everything you encounter is a monster. This led to an interesting terminological confusion over what the term monster really means. And Gary Gygax in 1978, actually felt compelled to explain this terminological confusion. And he says, the term monster is used throughout this work in two manners. Its first and most important meaning is to designate any creature encountered, hostile or otherwise, human, humanoid, or beast. Until the encountering party determines what they have come upon, it's a monster. The secondary usage of the term is in the usual sense, a horrible or wicked creature of some sort. The rules, therefore, equate monsters with any enemies that you can encounter. And being monstrous is then the default mode of being other within the game. And this, I think, is really kind of an uncanny echo of the cybernetic warfare's ontology of the enemy. Like, everything is by default an enemy. And this kind of conceptualization of the other is also emblematic of the mode of play that later became known as player versus environment, which Dungeons & Dragons kind of helped create. Skip this. Of course, Dungeons & Dragons was not just about statistics and mechanics. And in the paper that you can read, I talk a bit about role playing and the fact that the rules of the game were intentionally vague. But what's important for us now is that computer role playing games borrowed exactly this statistical and mechanical aspect, at least at the beginning. So Dungeons & Dragons had an immense influence on computer and video games, including Zelda, maybe including Euro Truck Simulator 2 also, although it doesn't have monsters. And in the early computer RPG adaptations, some of which you can see here, also Rogue is also there, killing monsters was even more prominent component of the game than in the pen and paper versions. Because combat, looting, and leveling mechanics were well-defined algorithms that were kind of ready-made and just kind of waited to be implemented in software. Already in 1975, the first computer adaptations of D&D surfaced. So monsters stood in for the machine, and they motivated a player action. They also became an essential kind of game content. They were used to attract people to the game, as you can see here on the example of Akalabeth from 1979, which boasts to have 10 different high-res monsters. And you can imagine how high-res monsters looked like in 1979. I want to look now at a more contemporary example, God of War, which is not a typical RPG game. It's an action RPG game. The combat is not stat-based, But while I was playing it, I was struck by how it follows so many of the conventions of the RPG genre, despite being released 44 years after D&D. So most God of War monsters, and especially Draugr, are basically cannon fodder. They're killed by the dozens. They are inspired by Norse myth, by the Draugr of the myth. And the original monsters in mythology kind of embody the fears of exclusion from local communities and all these things. And originally, there were not hundreds of them. There were, like 1 or 2 max, like per community or per village or something. So here they fulfill different functions. I was talking about bestiaries, and this logic of bestiary is repeated in computer role-playing games, and also in God of War. It's one of the conventions of computer role-playing games. Here, the bestiary is quite typical. It's sort of like a remediation of the medieval bestiary. So you can see that it's like a leather-bound codex. I mean, the font is not very medieval, but I guess that's for you to be able to read it. And it contains drawings and descriptions of individual monsters. And whenever the new creature is encountered, a new page is added. And the descriptions are stylized as if Atreus, the companion, the son and companion of the main character, Kratos, was writing them. So at times the descriptions are kind of trying to capture the awe and wonder that a young boy might feel when encountering these monsters like Draugr and ogres and dragons. Just an example, the description of a stone ancient, one of the monsters in the game, begins. One of the ancients, I can't believe it, did Mom know they were still alive? They're, well, ancient. And he goes like this, kind of expressing this wonder. After subsequent encounters, the entries are expanded by hints on how to fight these enemies, highlighting the weak spots and the special attacks, and kind of enhancing the status of these monsters as knowable, defeatable entities. And moreover, the naming and classification of these monsters seem to reflect the database structure of the game, rather than any subjective, sublime experience of mythological meaning. The various subtypes of Draugr in the game. Bear names such as Draugr, parenthesis, projectile, Draugr, power weapon, Draugr, speed, or Draugr, shield. So despite these strong allusions to Norse myth, these names sound a little bit like code names invented by the development team to kind of differentiate between the game, mechanically differentiate between these individual subtypes of Draugr. But nevertheless, these code names kind of inhabit these virtual pages of the Codex Bestiary, and I think that this demonstrates the extent to which encyclopedic containment has become a standard in computer and video games. So to conclude, I believe that the concept of encyclopedic containment can serve as a useful tool for critique of computer game monsters as content. Far too often, role-playing games trivialize the unknown, the mythical, and the monstrous, and turn them into these pests that need to be cleared and that are contained within these spreadsheets. And rather than provoking awe and terror, they simply give players something to do, and their transgressiveness is merely superficial. Like enemy bombers in Cold War era cybernetic warfare models, the purpose of these enemies is to be destroyed through skill and rational strategizing. But I also think that the sublime thesis remains an important normative ideal. So although most ordinary monsters leave little impact, game designers do try to impress the players with something that is out of the ordinary. And here I think that an example that might be interesting is the Souls series, which has been put forward by Daniel Vela as an example of sublime in video games. So the makers of Dark Souls kind of try to impress the players through the monsters who may evoke awe and terror through extreme difficulty, or sometimes through like repulsive or weird audiovisual design. And also Dark Souls purposefully obfuscates interface and rules so that the player doesn't really know what's happening most of the time. Using this title as an example, Daniel has argued that there's always a gap between the player's experience of the game, the player's understanding of the game as a system, and the player's awareness of an underlying implied game object. And in this gap, we can locate the operations of the ludic sublime. So in other words, if we look at it chronologically, there can be a temporary sublime which precedes any potential full encyclopedic knowledge of a system. But even the monsters of Dark Souls eventually are knowable, and detailed information about these monsters is shared on fan wikis. I think that it's still possible to maybe envision monsters that are unknowable or at least highly unpredictable, and as part of my research on monsters, I've also examined the game Alien Isolation to kind of probe the possibilities of monsters driven by artificial intelligence. And another potential avenue to explore might be procedural generation of monsters, but these are more like ideas for future research. And that's it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. I was wondering, just very briefly, you mentioned Noel Carroll's work there on philosophy before. So maybe I would like you to elaborate a little bit on the possibility of these monsters being not so sublime at all, but rather sort of down in the dirt and disgusting and all these things, but much more sort of lower form of monstrosity, one might say. Because I think Bloodborne might serve as a pretty okay example in the sense that it sort of wallows in dirt and blood and low forms of monstrosity, and then the higher forms here, and there's a whole religious sort of narrative baked onto what Vicar Amelia used to be and what she has now become. So I'm thinking, another way of saying it is, isn't it a little bit too, we only have sublime up there, so we need a couple of more categories of monstrosity.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think that Carroll writes about monstrosity as an instance of kind of cognitive jamming. Right? So there are these categories and they don't really fit together. So we don't know if it's a man or a wolf or if it's dead or alive, and that kind of makes us scared. And I think that it's a very useful theory, but I think that it's still kind of an instantiation of the sublime thesis, because there is something that is kind of cognitively challenging about it. But you may be right that it might be in between. But also the reason why I wasn't really talking too much about the visuals and the visual design of monsters is that I was more interested in the mechanics and on how monsters function within these games. And even though the monsters in Bloodborne and monsters in Dead Space and all these games, they are like very ugly, but they're ultimately knowable and defeatable, and the player kind of assumes that. So, okay, first time you're confronted with this, you might get a kind of feeling of sublime, but eventually, rationally, you know that these things are here for you to have fun.
Sure. Some of them are more disgusting than others.
Yeah.
More scary than others.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm interested, do you think that that you can consider the sublime as a attribute that can grade depending on the game mechanics, in the sense of like sometimes the sublime feeling that comes from a game in sense of Berg, if we go with that definition. Do you think it can be lower depending on the eventual effect that it has on your gameplay, in the sense of how much it punishes you if you fail? So if you compare a playthrough where you play an iron mode where if you die, that's that. Do you think that the feeling of sublime will be increased when you encounter a creature. For example, like in Dark Souls, when they introduce the mechanics of the souls where you're punished progressively while you're dying, which is one of the ways you progress through the game by dying, I think it changes the feeling of Sublime, the level of Sublime. Do you think that makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that I think the way that I presented it today was kind of straightforward and blunt. I think that there is grading, and I think that the experiences can differ based on difficulty, but also other things like visual design and I mean, especially I guess maybe like sound design and all these things. But eventually they all kind of converge to being things that are objects of player action most of the time. So I think that it's always only temporary. That would be my answer.
Hi, I think that was a very interesting presentation. So in many of the definitions of monsters that you gave, one of the key concepts that monsters turn on is this epistemic thing. It's knowledge, it's knowability. So maybe this is a bad question, but whose knowledge counts here for something to be a monster? Is it the player or the avatar? Because I can imagine a game where the player character, the avatar, is very well familiar with the creatures that live in its world. So maybe they're not monsters to them, they are to the player. Does that...
I think that's an interesting question. I think you could find all kinds of configurations. You could also, it could also be the other way around, but right? Like you as a player have already seen this monster, but the character hasn't. And if it was a pen and paper role-playing game, I think the player would kind of would be kind of obliged to actually role-play that. Like say, oh, this is a frightening monster, although he or she actually knows it and have encountered it before. So I think there could be different configurations of that. And also, I think that sometimes the player himself or herself don't have the knowledge, but they kind of rely on the fact that the knowledge is accessible. So, I mean, when you're playing Dark Souls, it is frightening, it is shocking, and it's difficult and frustrating, but you always can resort to these online sources where people share information about all these monsters. There is this justified assumption that if it's actualized in the code, then there is a way of knowing and of learning about this monster in order to defeat it.
I was just, you talked about Dark Souls, and I remember, I'm not a big Dark Souls player, but I remember some friends, I think it's in the first one where there's a dragon and you start or something like that, that you can't interact with, but then, like you said, as a player, you assume that at some point you will get to defeat or combat this foe. And if I understand your presentation right, it's about why we can't have these like omnipotent monsters that we can't defeat, that we don't think to defeat.
Yeah.
But don't you think some of it is taken that these omnipotence normally come from written media, and in this picture media, we kind of have this assumption, like I think it was Chekhov or someone who said if you show a gun, you also have to see getting shot, shoot, or something like that. So if you see a monster, you have like this assumption that there's something broken about the game if you don't also get to kill the monster.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is to some extent specific, I think, to computational media in a way. That in order for the monster to be able to appear for the player in the 3D simulation of the world, it has to be animated, it has to have some size, it has to have some polygons, it has to have some kind of physical properties. Otherwise, it wouldn't appear. Whereas in literature, you wouldn't really have that. So the amount of information, as in Dungeons and Dragons, the amount of information that you have to provide in order for the monster to even like be able to be in that world is so much that then the player automatically assumes that all this information is accessible to them, I think. So I think that it is specific to computational media. I think you're right in that, yeah.
Okay, I think we'll continue this at various pubs and over the rest of the week. Thank you very much, Jaroslav.
Thank you.